Somewhere inside nearly every corporate network on Earth sits a piece of security technology so old it predates the modern internet, as most people know it, and right now, quietly, without most IT departments even realizing the full scope of what is happening, Microsoft is tearing out its foundations and rebuilding them from scratch. If your company runs Windows, if you log into a work computer using a domain account, if your organization has an IT department managing user access at all, this change is coming for your network, whether anyone in your office has heard about it yet or not. Let's start by clearing something up immediately, because the headline framing of quietly retired deserves an honest correction before we go any further. Kerberos itself, the actual authentication protocol, is not disappearing. If anything, the opposite is happening. Kerberos is being pushed harder than ever to become the dominant default authentication method across every Windows network on the planet. What is actually being retired, quietly and deliberately, is something considerably older and considerably weaker, a legacy authentication protocol called NTLM, alongside a specific, dangerously outdated encryption method called RC4 that has been quietly riding along inside Kerberos itself for decades longer than most network administrators probably realize. To understand why any of this matters, you first need to understand what these two systems actually do, because authentication is one of those pieces of technology infrastructure that works so invisibly, so completely in the background, that most people who use it every single day have never actually thought about how it functions. Every time you type in your username and password to log into a work computer, or every time your computer automatically connects to a shared network drive or an internal company application without asking you to log in again, some underlying protocol is quietly verifying who you are and what you are allowed to access. For more than 3 decades, Windows networks have relied on 2 separate protocols to handle that verification, NTLM and Kerberos, often working alongside each other, frequently without administrators even being fully aware of which one was actually being used in any given situation. NTLM, short for NT LAN Manager, is the older of the two, originally introduced all the way back in 1993 with Windows NT 3.1, receiving a meaningful security upgrade to something called NTLM v2 6 years later. At the time it was introduced, NTLM solved a genuinely important problem, letting businesses move away from simple, disconnected desktop computers towards centralized, domain-based networks where a single login could grant access across shared files and resources. For a very long time, that was a genuine technological achievement. The problem is that NTLM was designed for a considerably less hostile internet than the one that exists today, and its underlying cryptographic approach has not meaningfully kept pace with 3 decades of advancing attacker sophistication. Kerberos, named after the 3-headed dog guarding the underworld in Greek mythology, an appropriately dramatic name for a security protocol, was introduced later specifically to address many of NTLM's shortcomings. Rather than relying on a challenge response system built around password hashes, the way NTLM does, Kerberos uses a considerably more sophisticated approach involving encrypted tickets issued by a centralized authority called a Key Distribution Center, commonly abbreviated as a KDC. When you log into a Kerberos protected network, you receive an encrypted ticket proving your identity, and that ticket, rather than your actual password or a hash derived from it, gets used to access various resources across the network, an approach that is considerably more resistant to several categories of common network attacks than NTLM's older methodology. Here is the genuinely uncomfortable truth that has persisted for years despite Kerberos existing as the clearly superior option. NTLM never actually went away, and understanding exactly why reveals a lot about how difficult large-scale security transitions genuinely are in practice, even when everyone involved broadly agrees on the right direction to move. NTLM is, in a specific sense, remarkably forgiving. Broken DNS configuration, unsynchronized system clocks, legacy, applications that were never updated to support Kerberos properly, all of these common everyday network hiccups cause Kerberos authentication to fail, while NTLM, with its considerably simpler underlying design, tends to keep working anyway. That reliability, ironically, has been NTLM's biggest problem all along. Windows has been quietly, automatically falling back to NTLM in exactly these situations for decades, meaning huge numbers of organizations who genuinely believed they were running modern, Kerberos-based, properly secured networks have actually had NTLM quietly operating in the background this entire time, frequently without anyone in their IT department fully realizing it. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we cover stories exactly like this every single week. Connecting the dots, most channels leave scattered. This hidden persistence is not merely an inconvenient technical footnote. It represents a genuinely serious, well-documented security risk that has been actively exploited by some of the most dangerous threat actors currently operating. NTLM's fundamental reliance on password hashes, rather than the considerably more sophisticated ticket-based system Kerberos uses, makes it structurally vulnerable to several well-known categories of attack, including replay attacks, where a captured authentication exchange gets reused by an attacker, and man-in-the-middle attacks, where an attacker intercepts and manipulates the authentication process as it happens. Security researchers have specifically documented NTLM's exploitation by numerous sophisticated threat groups, including operations tracked under names like Volt Typhoon, Scattered Spider, Wizard Spider, and Dragonfly, hacking groups responsible for some of the most consequential ransomware attacks and advanced persistent threat intrusions of the past several years. NTLM's hash-based authentication model has become what security researchers describe as a root enabler for exactly this category of devastating attack, giving intruders who manage to capture or crack an NTLM hash a genuinely powerful foothold for moving laterally across an entire compromised network. Microsoft first announced its intention to move away from NTLM back in 2023, formally marking the protocol as deprecated in the middle of 2024. And the company has since laid out a specific phased roadmap designed to move Windows networks away from NTLM, without triggering the kind of catastrophic, sudden outages that would occur if the protocol were simply switched off overnight across every network on Earth. Understanding that phased roadmap in detail matters enormously for anyone responsible for managing a Windows network, because the specific timeline determines exactly how much runway organizations genuinely have before this transition stops being optional guidance and starts being an enforced, non-negotiable default. Phase 1 of this transition, already underway and currently active, involves enhanced auditing tools built directly into Windows Server 2025 and Windows 11 version 24H2, and later. These tools exist specifically to give IT administrators their very first genuinely clear, comprehensive picture of exactly where NTLM authentication is still quietly happening across their own network, which specific devices are requesting it, which applications are triggering that fallback behavior, and which underlying dependencies remain that would break entirely if NTLM simply disappeared without warning. This auditing phase matters enormously because, as we just discussed, a huge number of organizations genuinely do not know the true scope of their own NTLM dependency until they actually go looking for it, using tools specifically designed to surface that hidden usage. Phase 2, scheduled for the second half of 2026, introduces several specific technical solutions designed to eliminate the most common underlying reasons NTLM gets triggered as a fallback in the first place, rather than simply blocking NTLM and hoping organizations figure out the rest on their own. A feature called IAKerb, short for Initial and Pass-Through Authentication using Kerberos, allows Kerberos authentication to succeed even in situations where a device cannot directly reach a domain controller, one of the most common scenarios that historically force networks to fall back on NTLM instead. A separate feature called Local KDC extends genuine Kerberos support to local account authentication, addressing another extremely common trigger for NTLM fallback that has persisted for years, specifically because Kerberos historically required a full domain infrastructure that local accounts simply do not have access to. Alongside these two specific features, Microsoft is also updating core Windows components themselves to actively negotiate and prefer Kerberos first in situations where either protocol could theoretically work, rather than defaulting toward whichever protocol happens to be quicker or simpler to establish in the moment. Phase 3 represents the actual tipping point in this entire transition, arriving with the next major Windows Server release and its corresponding Windows client releases. At that point, network NTLM authentication will be disabled by default across new installations, meaning organizations that genuinely still need NTLM for some specific, legitimate, unavoidable reason will need to explicitly re-enable it through dedicated policy controls, rather than simply having it silently available as an invisible fallback the way it has operated for the past 3 decades. Microsoft has stated it will build in dedicated support for handling the specific, narrower, NTLM-only scenarios that genuinely cannot be avoided. Things like accessing certain targets with unknown service principal names, authentication requests made directly, using IP addresses rather than proper domain names, and local accounts on domain-joined machines, reducing the likelihood of unexpected application breakage, even as the broader default shifts firmly toward Kerberos across the board. Now let's turn to the second, closely related half of this story because it involves Kerberos itself, and it reveals that even the more modern, more secure protocol has been quietly carrying its own decades-old weakness that Microsoft is now finally deliberately addressing. Kerberos tickets need to be encrypted using some specific cryptographic algorithm, and for a very long time, one of the available options was something called RC4, a stream cipher that was reasonably strong when Kerberos first adopted it, but that has since become considerably outdated and genuinely vulnerable to modern cracking techniques, particularly a specific category of attack security researchers call Kerberosting, where an attacker requests service tickets for accounts within a network and then attempts to crack the resulting RC4 encrypted ticket offline, entirely outside the target network's own visibility, specifically to recover the underlying service account password. Here's the detail that makes this specific vulnerability genuinely concerning. Rather than merely theoretical, RC4 has continued quietly persisting as a fallback cipher for Kerberos service tickets even inside networks that genuinely believed they were running an AES-only fully modernized configuration. Stronger encryption standards, specifically AES-SHA-1, in both its AES 128 and AES 256 variants, have actually been available across every supported version of Windows, going all the way back to Windows Server 2008, meaning there has been very little legitimate technical reason to still be running RC4 in any reasonably modern network environment for well over a decade now. And yet, because of exactly the same kind of quiet, invisible fallback behavior we discussed regarding NTLM, RC4 has continued lurking inside supposedly secure networks, specifically because service accounts and computer accounts that never had an explicit encryption type configured would simply, silently default back to the weaker, older cipher whenever it remained available. Microsoft's response to this specific problem arrived through a security update tied to a vulnerability tracked as CVE 2026-2833. And the rollout has followed a similarly deliberate, staged approach to the broader NTLM transition, moving through a sequence security teams describe as detect, then warn, then enforce, and finally remove the fallback option entirely. January 2026 marked the beginning of an audit and telemetry phase, giving administrators visibility into exactly where RC4 dependencies genuinely exist across their own network without yet actually blocking anything or breaking existing authentication. April of 2026 marked a significant escalation, with Windows updates changing the default Kerberos ticket issuance behavior so that domain controllers began defaulting to AES-SHA-1 encryption, specifically for accounts that lacked an explicit encryption type configuration, while still allowing administrators a manual rollback option back to the older, more permissive audit mode if genuinely necessary during the transition period. July of 2026 marked the removal of that rollback option entirely, leaving full enforcement as the only supported behavior going forward, meaning any remaining RC4 dependencies that had not yet been identified and properly remediated by that point began experiencing genuine authentication failures rather than simply generating warning messages administrators could choose to ignore. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we cover stories exactly like this every single week. Connecting the dots, most channels leave scattered. The practical consequences of missing this specific transition deserve genuinely careful attention, because the way these failures actually present themselves to ordinary users, and even to IT support staff, is considerably less obvious than you might expect from a major, deliberately planned security change. When RC4 gets deprecated and enforcement kicks in, affected users typically do not see any kind of clear, helpful message explaining that RC4 has been disabled or that their account needs an updated encryption configuration. Instead, they simply encounter ordinary-looking, frustratingly generic authentication failures, messages like "authentication failed," "cannot connect to the server," or "access denied" when attempting to reach shared network drives or other Kerberos-protected internal services, the exact wording varying depending on which specific client or application happens to be involved. This ambiguity genuinely matters, because it means IT help desks handling a sudden wave of confusing, seemingly unrelated login complaints across their organization might spend considerable time troubleshooting what looks like a scattered, disconnected series of individual problems before eventually recognizing they are all actually symptoms of the exact same underlying RC4 enforcement change quietly rolling out across their network infrastructure. Certain specific categories of hardware and software face genuinely elevated risk here, and understanding exactly which systems are most likely to break helps explain why Microsoft built such an extended, deliberately staged timeline for this transition, rather than simply flipping a switch all at once. Non-Windows devices and applications represent one significant risk category, since Linux machines, macOS clients, network-connected printers, and various legacy applications relying on RC4, only Kerberos libraries will straightforwardly fail to authenticate once enforcement takes effect. And critically, the absence of any warning events showing up on a Windows domain controller does not actually guarantee that these non-Windows systems will continue working correctly once RC4 support is fully removed, meaning administrators genuinely need to test these systems explicitly rather than assuming a clean audit log means everything is fine. Windows Server 2003 represents another specific, well-documented risk, since that particular operating system version never supported AES SHA-1 encryption at all, meaning organizations still running genuinely ancient infrastructure on that platform, and such organizations absolutely still exist scattered across various industries, needed to either retire or carefully isolate those systems entirely before enforcement began, since no software update could ever retroactively grant AES support to hardware and software that fundamentally never had it built in from the start. It is worth understanding the Kerberos attack technique in a bit more detail, because it explains precisely why RC4's continued presence inside Kerberos has remained such a persistently attractive target for attackers over the years, even in networks that had otherwise invested heavily in broader security hardening. Any authenticated user on a network, even one with genuinely minimal privileges, can request a service ticket from essentially any service account registered within Active Directory, entirely as part of Kerberos' normal everyday operation. If that requested ticket happens to be encrypted using RC4 rather than AES, an attacker can take that ticket away from the network entirely and attempt to crack it offline on hardware they fully control without ever triggering any kind of alert or lockout mechanism on the actual target network itself, since nothing about the offline cracking process ever touches the organization's own systems or logs, because service accounts frequently carry elevated privileges, and because their passwords are often set once during initial configuration and then essentially forgotten about for years afterward. A successfully cracked RC4 ticket can hand an attacker a genuinely powerful set of credentials, sometimes credentials with domain administrator level access, entirely through a technique that requires no direct exploitation of any software vulnerability whatsoever, simply patient, methodical. Exploitation of a cryptographic weakness, Microsoft has now spent much of 2026 working to systematically eliminate. There's also a closely related, frequently overlooked corner of this same broader cryptographic cleanup worth mentioning specifically, involving something called NetLogon, a separate but related secure channel mechanism used for authentication between domain member computers and domain controllers. Some IT professionals actively tracking Microsoft's broader RC4 elimination effort throughout 2026 have specifically raised questions about whether NetLogon's own continued RC4 usage, distinct from the Kerberos-specific changes we have focused on throughout most of this video, has received the same level of aggressive attention. Microsoft has provided administrators with a specific registry setting capable of disabling RC4 usage within NetLogon domain-wide, though the company's public messaging around this particular corner of the transition has been considerably less prominent and less thoroughly documented than the primary Kerberos and NTLM-focused announcements that have dominated most of the coverage throughout the year. This detail matters because it illustrates a genuinely important, broader point about large-scale security transitions like this one. The most visible, most heavily publicized changes rarely represent the complete, entire picture. And organizations genuinely serious about closing every meaningful gap need to look beyond just the headline announcements toward the full, sometimes less prominently documented technical detail Microsoft continues publishing throughout the year as this transition keeps unfolding in stages. There is also a particularly tricky, easily overlooked scenario specifically involving something called the KRBTGT account, the special account underlying the entire Kerberos trust relationship within a given Windows domain. If a domain was originally created using older Windows Server 2003 domain controllers and subsequently upgraded over the years to newer Windows Server versions, but the KRBTGT account's password itself was never actually changed. Following that upgrade, that critical account can end up lacking the proper AES encryption keys entirely, even though the rest of the domain environment appears fully modern and up to date on the surface. If that specific situation goes unaddressed before RC4 enforcement takes hold, the consequences extend considerably further than a handful of isolated login failures, potentially producing widespread Kerberos authentication failures across an entire domain simultaneously, precisely because the fundamental trust anchor underlying the whole authentication system itself was never properly updated during what everyone assumed was a routine, successfully completed infrastructure upgrade years earlier. Certain specific enterprise applications have also drawn particular attention from Microsoft and from IT professionals actively working through this transition, and one especially notable example involves FSLogix, a widely used technology for managing user profiles within virtual desktop environments, specifically in scenarios where profile storage depends on network file shares integrated with Active Directory. Microsoft has specifically flagged that organizations relying on this particular configuration should pay close, deliberate attention to their encryption settings well before enforcement fully takes hold, since a failure here does not just inconvenience an individual user logging into a single shared drive. It can potentially prevent entire virtual desktop environments from loading user profiles correctly at all, a genuinely serious organization-wide disruption. If it catches an unprepared IT team by surprise during a routine software update rollout, they assumed would be uneventful. So what does an organization actually need to do here, practically speaking, to navigate both of these closely related transitions successfully rather than getting caught flat-footed by an authentication failure wave nobody saw coming? The kind of wave that tends to arrive right when an IT team least expects it and least has the spare capacity to handle it gracefully? For the NTLM side of this story, the recommended approach begins with genuinely comprehensive auditing, using the enhanced logging tools Microsoft has already made available to build an accurate, evidence-based picture of exactly where NTLM remains quietly active across the organization's own specific network, rather than simply assuming a modern, largely Kerberos-based environment means NTLM dependency is minimal or non-existent. From there, IT teams need to systematically test genuinely critical business workloads and applications with NTLM deliberately disabled inside a non-production, isolated testing environment, specifically to surface any hidden compatibility gaps well before those gaps have any chance of affecting real live business operations. Microsoft has specifically encouraged organizations to begin adopting the newer Kerberos capabilities, iAdKerb and local KDC among them, through the Windows Insider program initially, before those same capabilities eventually roll out more broadly to the general population of Windows users later in the year, giving more cautious, risk-averse organizations a genuine opportunity to validate compatibility on their own terms and their own timeline, rather than being forced into a sudden, unplanned migration once enforcement finally arrives. For the RC4 side of this same broader transition, the practical remediation path looks somewhat different, but follows a broadly similar underlying philosophy. Identify dependencies first, then systematically address them well ahead of whatever specific enforcement deadline applies to your organization's particular Windows Server version and update cadence. Administrators are specifically encouraged to monitor domain controller event logs for a defined set of Kerberos-related audit events, tracking specific event IDs that flag exactly when and where RC4 encrypted tickets are still actively being issued or requested across the network. Beyond the dedicated audit events Microsoft built specifically for this purpose, administrators can also examine standard Windows security auditing logs, specifically looking at event IDs associated with ticket granting, ticket requests, an individual service, ticket operations, since RC4 usage shows up as a specific identifiable value within the ticket encryption type field, recorded in those particular log entries, giving experienced administrators a genuinely reliable, verifiable way to confirm exactly which accounts and systems still depend on the older, weaker cipher before enforcement removes that fallback option entirely. Once RC4 dependencies have actually been identified through this kind of careful auditing process, the remediation itself generally involves updating each specific account's supported encryption type setting to explicitly require AES-A1, rather than leaving that configuration blank or undefined, which is precisely the specific, quietly dangerous condition that has allowed so many networks to unknowingly retain hidden RC4 dependencies for years, without anyone actually intending for that outcome to happen in the first place. For service accounts specifically, and for any network-connected devices like older printers or file storage systems that fundamentally cannot be upgraded to support AES encryption at all, organizations generally face a genuinely difficult choice between retiring that specific piece of legacy hardware or software entirely, or deliberately, consciously isolating it within a more tightly restricted, carefully monitored segment of the broader network, specifically to limit the security exposure that maintaining an RC4 dependency inevitably continues to represent. It is worth stepping back at this point to appreciate the genuinely significant scope of what Microsoft is actually attempting here, because viewed together rather than as two separate, unrelated announcements, these changes represent one of the most substantial cryptographic and authentication overhauls the Windows ecosystem has undergone in years, arguably in decades, touching virtually every domain-joined device, every service account, and every legacy application quietly woven throughout enterprise networks built up over multiple decades of continuous, incremental IT infrastructure investment. Security analysts covering this transition have specifically described it as one of Microsoft's most significant cryptographic cleanup efforts in recent memory, precisely because it tackles two deeply entrenched, historically difficult to fully eliminate legacy weaknesses simultaneously. Weaknesses that have persisted for so long, largely because removing them risked breaking countless real-world business processes that had, over decades, quietly come to depend on exactly the permissive, backward-compatible behavior that made both NTLM and RC4 such attractive, convenient targets for attackers into Wumao's first place. It is also worth understanding why this transition specifically arrived in 2026, rather than years earlier when these underlying weaknesses were already well documented and well understood within the security research community. Part of the answer involves a broader industry-wide shift in how seriously identity and authentication infrastructure gets treated as a primary attack surface, rather than a largely settled, mostly solved problem sitting quietly in the background of network security planning. For years, security investment across the industry tended to concentrate heavily on perimeter defenses, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, endpoint antivirus software, treating the network boundary itself as the primary line of defense against attackers. As ransomware operators and advanced persistent threat groups increasingly demonstrated their ability to breach that perimeter through phishing, social engineering, and other means entirely unrelated to authentication protocols themselves, security researchers and vendors alike began recognizing that identity infrastructure, exactly the kind of authentication systems we have spent this entire video discussing, represented an equally critical, historically underdefended layer that attackers were already exploiting aggressively once they gained any initial foothold inside a target network. Analysts covering this broader shift have specifically pointed to Active Directory's roughly 25-year legacy as a genuinely significant, still unresolved security issue precisely because so much of its underlying architecture, including the NTLM and RC4 weaknesses we have covered throughout this video, was designed during an era when the scale and sophistication of modern cyber attacks simply did not yet exist as a serious planning consideration. There is a broader lesson embedded inside this entire story that extends well beyond just Windows networking specifically, one worth sitting with, regardless of whether you personally manage IT infrastructure for a living. Security weaknesses do not typically persist inside major technology platforms because nobody at the responsible company recognizes the underlying problem. NTLM's weaknesses have been genuinely well understood, and Kerberos has existed as the demonstrably superior alternative for a very long time now. These weaknesses persist because backward compatibility, the promise that older systems, older applications, and older hardware will simply continue working after an update rather than suddenly breaking, is itself an enormously valuable, deeply ingrained property that technology companies are understandably reluctant to sacrifice carelessly, even when maintaining that compatibility means quietly preserving genuinely serious, well-documented security risk for years or even decades longer than would ever be ideal from a purely security-focused perspective, considered in complete isolation. What makes this specific transition worth understanding, whether or not you personally administer a Windows network for a living, is watching exactly how a major technology company navigates that genuinely difficult tension in practice between fixing a well-known, serious, long-standing security problem and avoiding the kind of sudden, catastrophic breakage that would occur if that same fix were simply carelessly applied all at once, without any warning or transition period whatsoever. Microsoft's specific approach here: detect first through genuinely comprehensive auditing, then warn administrators clearly and repeatedly well in advance, then enforce gradually and predictably according to a clearly published timeline, then finally remove the older, weaker fallback option entirely once. Enforcement has had adequate time to take hold, represents a genuinely thoughtful, deliberately measured template for exactly how large-scale infrastructure security transitions probably ought to happen across the technology industry more broadly, rather than the kind of sudden, unannounced change that leaves IT teams scrambling reactively to fix urgent problems they never saw coming with anywhere near enough advance warning to prepare properly. So if you work anywhere near IT infrastructure, network administration, or enterprise security, and this entire story is genuinely new information to you right now, that alone is worth treating as a meaningful, actionable signal in its own right. Enhanced auditing tools for both NTLM and RC4 dependency detection are already available today, right now, for Windows Server 2025 and Windows 11 version 24H2. And later, and Microsoft has been remarkably explicit and consistent in stating that the specific time to genuinely begin identifying and addressing these lingering dependencies is now, well before enforcement fully arrives, and transforms a proactive, carefully planned migration into a considerably more urgent, reactive scramble to fix authentication failures, actively disrupting real business operations in real time. For everyone else simply using a Windows computer at work without any direct IT responsibility of your own, understanding this transition still matters in its own right, because it offers a genuinely useful, concrete window into just how much invisible, foundational infrastructure quietly underlies every single ordinary login you perform at work each and every day. Technology so deeply embedded, so completely taken for granted, that most people never think about it at all until the specific moment it actually breaks and suddenly, urgently demands their immediate attention. The next time your work computer prompts an unexpected login failure, or your IT department sends out a notice about an upcoming authentication-related maintenance window, there is a genuinely reasonable chance it traces back to exactly this broader transition. Decades-old cryptographic debt finally, deliberately being paid down, one carefully staged enforcement deadline at a time. Kerberos is not being quietly retired. It is being deliberately, carefully strengthened, finally shedding decades of accumulated cryptographic baggage it had been quietly, invisibly carrying since long before most of today's IT professionals ever entered the field. NTLM, the genuinely older, considerably weaker technology riding alongside it this entire time, is the one actually being retired, gradually, deliberately, and after this specific multi-year transition finally concludes, Windows networks around the entire world will be measurably, meaningfully more secure precisely because of it. If you want to keep following how this transition continues unfolding throughout the rest of 2026 and beyond, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the follow-up. Because between the ongoing NTLM phase out, the RC4 enforcement deadlines, and whatever new Windows Server release finally makes NTLM disabled by default, this particular story is going to keep generating genuinely important updates worth understanding clearly for a good while yet.